Now to a decision that could reshape the effort to defeat President Trump. Joe Biden saying he may announce his running mate any day. New reports that he's down to a very short list, including well-known names like Kamala Harris and Susan Rice and a few others. Which brings us to tonight's Backstory, our series that tries to provide substantive reporting on one person in the presidential cycle. We reported on Harris and Demings, and now we turn to a popular but probably lesser-known figure on this list, Karen Bass. The California congresswoman was picked by her peers to run the Congressional Black Caucus, and she has a history in grassroots politics from volunteering as a teenager on the 1968 RFK campaign, then taking what she saw as basically the lessons from working as a physician's assistant and applying them to social change. She founded a nonprofit that tackled community problems like poverty, drugs, and crime. And while some movements tout their charismatic and famous leaders, Bass was saying back then that she didn't want any celebrity-style politics, even telling new recruits, if you're here to make a name for yourself, you should find another place to work. The organization, the Community Coalition, soon became one of LA's largest and most influential advocacy groups, according to the New York Times, tackling long-standing issues like poverty to newer developments that came up, like the unrest and devastation after the protests and riots when the cops who beat Rodney King were acquitted, and that was the response. Bass was out there surveying the damage and working on tangible reforms afterward. She even wrote this 1992 op-ed about a campaign to limit the many, many liquor stores that appeared in poorer neighborhoods, arguing they stoked wider problems. Allies say that was classic Karen Bass, digging into a real issue that mattered regardless of whether it got any national attention. And by the way, the saturation of liquor stores in poor and minority communities is a long-standing issue. Sean Carter himself famously intoned, "Mr. Governor, I swear there's a cover-up. Every other corner, there's a liquor store. F is up." And there's a direct line from that early 90s grassroots work to how Bass tackles justice reform now.
As I watched the news those 3 days, realizing that the organization was going to be put in a situation where we were going to have to step up. We are supposed to be the beacon of hope for human rights in other countries, and the Justice and Policing Act is a bill for human rights in our country.
We are not going to stop until we get a transformative bill on the president's desk.
That's where you see Bass now as a national leader. And that's partly because her own congressional colleagues picked her. But that trend first began in the California legislature, where her state colleagues chose her to be Assembly Speaker, breaking a barrier out of all 50 states in the union.
Thunderous applause and a rock star-like greeting today from the new Assembly Speaker Karen Bass, who was feeling
The weight of history on my shoulders today as the first African-American woman in U.S. history elected to be Speaker of a legislative body.
That was 2008, but there was basically no time to savor the historic first. Bass was running a legislature that was running into an immediate crisis.
Meltdown. The American financial system is rocked to its foundation.
Stocks plunged after the opening bell as wary investors digest yet another blow to the economy.
It was perhaps the worst financial collapse since the Great Depression.
With California house prices falling by 50% or more, those who bought during the bubble are in big trouble.
The financial crash rocked California, destroying state revenue, and when it struggled with debts, the state's credit score was downgraded. Now, as Democrats eye Bass for a job that is pretty close to running, of course, the whole country, this is where she actually has more experience than many members of Congress. As California Speaker, she was the government official responsible for an economy that, if it were a country, would be about the 5th largest in the whole world, between Germany and India. She was responsible for all of that in tandem with one other official, the governor.
We have declared a fiscal emergency, and every day that goes by makes the budget problem that much harder to solve. As a result of all of this, California, the 8th largest economy in the world, faces insolvency within weeks.
All of that meant Bass, the longtime activist and the community organizer, was now a top government official hurtling towards a pitched battle with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And, of course, he's had other battles in his life and on screen. But this was, if you think about it, even more complicated than the duel in the film T2, because while Bass was set to play the role of an epic nemesis to Arnold, if you think about it, it was even more difficult than a one-on-one, because under the state law rules, you needed a 2/3 supermajority for budget votes, meaning Bass, who was popular among her colleagues, now had to press on them and get hard calls made and also win over 3 Republican votes.
I think the biggest obstacle, which I hope that we can overcome, is if both sides of it approach it in real ideological terms.
Now then, as now, Bass was a liberal Democrat, but she approached that task trying to lead towards an actual solution, not just get her own ideological way. And people working on the budget noted that Republicans wanted to cut spending, Democrats wanted to raise taxes. It was a classic dilemma, but the hole there, the budget hole was so big, one top Republican noting we could never cut enough to balance the budget, nor raise taxes enough to balance the budget. They needed more. They needed a deal. The pressure was on for both sides to compromise on ideology, on campaign pledges. And then, because that's hard to get politicians to do, recession or not, when some of them wouldn't budge with millions of jobs on the line, this was a huge deal. Bass was telling her colleagues, you're not leaving until you reach a deal. Literally.
A rare sight in the California state capitol last night. The legislature locked down, the leaders forcing lawmakers to come up with a budget plan or a place to sleep.
My members are here, and they're going to be here until we get this deal done.
How about that? Now, Bass won some hard compromises, but then found the governor wouldn't even sign that, and she started playing hardball in public.
It's like a child telling Santa, if you don't bring every single item on my list, then stay out of my chimney.
That was her view of Governor Schwarzenegger. Meanwhile, regular Californians were suffering during that recession, the government stalling out and potentially bailing on its own obligations.
Californians will not get tax refund checks if we do not act.
The Comptroller's Office is actively considering issuing IOUs instead of refunds due to a cash squeeze.
Considering that I work and I pay my taxes, of course I want some of my money back.
So as Democrats and Joe Biden look for a doer, someone who can really lead and deal with big, hard calls, not just give floor speeches, you have to look at the scale and the scope of this. Many may have forgotten, but this was the issue facing millions of people's everyday lives.
This latest action to solve our $42 billion deficit was difficult but courageous.
Courage by who? I didn't see any courage.
We have courage, we have brains, and we have hearts. The legislators and the governor need to get a brain and use it.
There was heat on all sides. And Bass was facing Democrats concerned about deep cuts to education and social programs, and she acknowledged once unthinkable cuts were needed.
For Democrats, I have to tell you that many of the cuts that we had to make in another time we would have thought were unthinkable. But because of the unprecedented and ongoing recession that's plaguing our nation and our state, we certainly did not feel that we had a choice.
Bass and Schwarzenegger kept at it, pushing, making concessions. And then it brings us naturally to another one of his movies, the little-known 1970 film Hercules in New York.
Skip the wisecracks. Put your money where your mouth is.
I do not have any money.
All right, you asked for it.
You have struck Hercules.
This will teach you respect for your elders!
Okay, why are we talking about this right now? Because however bad that movie looks, the negotiations were even worse. And before you think, wait, Ari, that's pretty harsh to Arnold, keep in mind, that was actually Arnold's line.
The negotiations were worse than sitting through my first movie, Hercules, in New York. And let me tell you, when I say that, that means a lot.
Now, however painful it was to get through after those sleepless marathon sessions and the standoffs and the posturing, that governor and Bass reached a deal. averting the fiscal crisis that both had said would be far worse without a deal. That news echoing across the state. The plan slashed basically public health programs, crucial programs, and some other popular liberal agendas by over $14 billion. It also, on the conservative side, what they were worried about, it hiked taxes by over $12 billion. A deal with pain for all sides meant the governor and his Republican colleagues were breaking their pledges against new taxes. Some Republicans losing their seats over it in the next election, while Bass insisted that it was needed to save the economy by pruning parts of the safety net and arguing the net itself could still work.
We have closed the deficit in a responsible manner. We wanted to make sure that during this time of economic recession, when people need services more, that we did not eliminate the safety net for California.
And there you have it. To cite a simple lesson from Coldplay, nobody said it was easy. Now, Bass did deliver on the consensus, and one of her Republican colleagues credited her, saying there aren't a lot of people who are well-liked and well-respected. Karen is one of them. A former Assembly Speaker credited the leadership on display, touting Bass as a coalition builder who wanted the buy-in. And then in a scene that might be pretty hard to imagine happening now, she joined up with her Republican colleagues to accept a joint bipartisan award, not for beating the other side, but for working together. And then we were digging through all this, and we found it in classic Bass fashion, while accepting a John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award, which probably meant extra to her given the long-ago work with the Kennedy family. She took it, and she made that night all about her colleagues for getting the deal done.
I will be accepting this award on behalf of all the women and men of the California Assembly who painfully cast tough votes in a time of crisis. I also will accept it as motivation to continue fighting to protect the integrity and the promise of public education and higher education in California, the foundation of the future for California.
An ambitious Democratic politician gets a Kennedy Award and makes it about other people. That's part of the spirit that some of Bass's allies say distinguish her from other politicians, which is how she earned that trust in the Assembly and found herself tapped again to lead the CBC, a coalition with plenty of experienced leaders and big personalities. It's why her allies hope Biden basically does his vetting homework when comparing the experience of multiple qualified contenders. Bass's critics argue against her more vocal liberal positions going on the ticket now. And some say the sacrifices that she did negotiate with the governor at the state level are not a model for Democrats to replicate anytime soon. But when you take a little bit of time here and look at her record, it's just a reminder of how superficial the political lens in Washington can be, reducing people's entire careers to categories or a simple ideology. Since this liberal official's really most consequential achievement for her constituents was achieving a centrist and bipartisan deal. Now, as I've told you before, in this series, we don't try to tackle every issue in one contender's past. It's a whole life they've lived, let alone endorse the different people that we're looking at. But I will tell you, at a time when a lot of Americans look up and see a broken politics, we do try to take the time to go beyond those labels and categories and learn a little bit more about these people who might be on the ticket. And with Karen Bass, you see a whole rich history you might not have known as Joe Biden decides who he would like to run to be potentially a heartbeat away from the presidency. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.